Hi everyone, welcome back, and this short little lecture is about waves of democracy. One of the things that's important to understand is that democratization and regime change does not happen in isolation. Oftentimes there are what we call waves, and Samuel Huntington first wrote a book called The Third Wave where he talks about this tendency among democratization to occur in large groups, that a large group of countries will convert to democracy and then transition. A lot of them will transition back what he calls a reverse wave. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. The big point here, though, is that democratization is not linear. It's not just one country becomes democratic and then at some other point another country becomes democratic and at some other point still another country does it. There are waves and reverse waves, and Huntington in his book talked about three waves. We now think that we've seen a fourth wave of democratization. We'll talk about that a little bit. And possibly we're seeing a fourth reverse wave. So first of all, let's talk about these three waves. Huntington describes three of them. The first wave occurred in the early 1900s, and there were about 24 new democracies. Following the transition of about 24, 25 authoritarian regimes to democracy, we then saw a reversal from the 1920s to 1940s as those new democracies failed to survive and reverted back to authoritarianism. Not all of them reverted back, but a large number of them did. The second wave came in the 1940s through about the 1960s. Here, about 36 new democracies transition, and then between the 1960s and 70s, a lot of those transitioned back to authoritarian rule, so that was the reverse wave. And then the third wave, Huntington points to the 1970s, and he doesn't know when it ended. Now, looking back over time, we think it ended sometime around the 1990s. And that sometime around the 2000s or 2010, we're starting to see what looks like a fourth wave, even though the different waves like what we call the color revolutions in Eastern Europe and the Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa, those happened in different time points, but they're close enough together we can consider those collectively as a wave. And of course, we're seeing, as in Egypt, a lot of those democracies, and Ukraine as well, reverting back to authoritarian rule. That's the big picture thing from Huntington, and is important, but I will honestly tell you that the Huntington excerpt is probably the least important reading this week. Skim through it, look at the waves, get a sense of the idea of what these waves are, but that's mainly the big point. So just to reiterate, the main lessons from the Huntington reading is that democratization occurs in these waves, and transitions to democracy are not permanent. A lot of times, in fact, almost every one of these waves, we've seen a reversal where at least half of those countries revert back to authoritarianism. We saw this with the Arab Spring. Again, Egypt is a quintessential example. It transitioned to democracy, had democracy for a little while, then there were protests and the government stepped in and effectively removed the democratically elected government. And now we have something of a military rule. There's talk of it becoming another transition to democracy sometime in the future, but Egypt certainly is one of the examples of a reversal of a new democracy that did not survive very long. And importantly, these reversals also happen in waves. So we talk about the Arab Spring, but then some people are talking about the current environment as the Arab Winter, the dying of a lot of these new democracies. So let's talk about waves and ripples. And now we're talking about the Markov reading. And this one's a little more important. It's something that you should go through and look at with an eye for the things we're going to talk about. What are the significant differences in which countries appear more democratic versus not? Which countries were more likely to transition to democracy and which countries were less? Well, a couple of things we know is that wealthier countries are more likely to be democratic. As we'll talk about next week with modernization, that is a pattern that we have noticed going back to the 1950s. We have 60 to 70 years of academic research that show that wealthier countries tend to be more democratic, poorer countries much less likely, and those countries are slower to democratize. It's not simply that they're less likely to be democracies, but they take a longer time to transition. Why is that? That is the heart of modernization theory, to explain this difference between rich and poor countries in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism. So we'll talk about that the next 2 weeks. Religion is another factor. It's actually a really interesting factor, and on average, Protestant countries are more likely to be democratic, and Muslim countries are the least likely to be democratic. And the question for that is, why? Why is there this religious difference between the countries and democracies? And there are a couple of different theories. We're going to talk about this week, I believe it's week 5, that we're going to talk about this aspect of it, inhibitors democracy. One cites religion itself. It points the causal arrow at the tenets of the religion. That's a very controversial view. If it's not obvious why, it will be. Another answer is culture. Is there something about the culture in these countries that make them less democratic, independent of religion? And another question that gets asked is the Middle East unique? Is there something unique about that region? Because what some of the studies have shown is that outside of the Middle East, religion has no effect on democratization. In fact, the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, is considered a strong, stable democracy. And so is there something outside of the Middle East itself? And folded into this as well that we'll also talk about are natural resources. There's theories that point to things like oil wealth and mineral wealth. So in Africa, for instance, there's a lot of, you've heard probably about blood diamonds. In the Middle East, you certainly know large share of their economy is based on oil. Well, that's one of the causal explanations that some scholars point to. And beyond that, there's also income inequality as an explanation. So these are some of the big differences between which countries become more democratic and which are less likely to become democratic. And we're going to take a deep dive into trying to explain these differences over the next couple of weeks. So John Markoff, he lists 4 factors that are related to transitions. They're here. Go read his article. I'm just going to briefly touch on them here, but you should know these 4 factors. There's internal processes. These are unique to each country, but there's similarities across them. There's external processes that are not directly aimed at democracy, but operate similarly across countries. There's emulative processes. This is diffusion, and this, frankly, is one of the explanations for the waves of democracy. The quintessential example for emulative processes or a diffusion theory is the Arab Spring. That the Egyptian revolution probably would not have occurred had Tunisia not first transitioned. That the man who set himself on fire in Tunisia to protest the government, the mass protest against the government, and then the transition of that government to a democratic state is thought to have inspired Egypt and the other demonstrations around the Middle East that became known as the Arab Spring. So this is, when you think about emulative processes, this is what we're talking about. And then there's supportive processes, which are actors around other countries seek to influence democracy elsewhere. Again, Iraq is probably a good example of this, but there's beyond just war and installing a democracy, there's also actors around, particularly in the West, who try to promote democracy in other countries. The one thing you do need to pay attention to with Markoff is find the section about your country's region, the country that you're going to do a case study on. And you don't need to read all of the regions, but do read and focus in on the region where your country is located. So let's say that you're doing Malaysia. Malaysia's in Southeast Asia, so read Markoff's section on Asian transitions. The important thing is notice how Markoff examines each region through the prism of the 4 factors. He takes those 4 factors and he tries to analyze each region and say, okay, this factor had the biggest effect and this other factor didn't, and these 2 factors had mixed effects. And that varies by region. This is very similar to what you're going to be doing in the future projects, where you take your country and you look at it through the prism of the theories. We're not going to be using Markoff's 4 factors. We're going to be using different theories to explain this, but it's the same idea. This theory predicts, for example, that countries above a certain amount of wealth will transition to democracy. Okay, well, you look at your country and you look at the level of wealth when it transitioned, and you determine, well, that's what the theory would predict. Or maybe the theory didn't predict, and that can be very interesting as well. So the important thing about Huntington is this notion that democratization happens in waves and that there are reverse waves. And the important thing about Markov is showing you how we're going to analyze your country cases through the rest of the semester. So that's it, short lecture. That's all I have to say about this, and the next video up will be showing you how to use Freedom House and polity scores to write that first project, the defining democracy in your country, and then we're done with material and we'll have the discussion.